I didn't say a word when Karen Hendricks, the HOA president, slapped that $1,000 fine notice on my kitchen table and told me I was trespassing on community water resources. I just pulled out the leather folder I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, opened it to the county recorder's stamp, dated 1847, and watched her face drain of color as she read the words "Riparian water rights in perpetuity." Her lawyer, who'd been leaning back in his chair with that smug expression, suddenly sat forward and started flipping through pages like his career depended on it, which, as it turned out, it did. The thing is, I never wanted to be the guy who destroys an HOA. When I bought the cabin on Willow Lake 3 years ago, I was looking for the exact opposite of conflict. I'd just gone through a brutal divorce, lost my dad to cancer, and spent 18 months working 60-hour weeks just to keep my head above water. The realtor found this place almost by accident, the 1960s A-frame that hadn't been updated since. Carter was president, sitting on 2 acres of overgrown land with 200 feet of lake frontage. The price was reasonable because it needed everything: new roof, new plumbing, electrical work that would make an inspector weep. But when I walked down to that water for the first time and saw the way the morning mist rose off the surface, how the old wooden docks stretched into water so clear you could see bass swimming 10 feet down, I knew I was home. I spent my first summer there rebuilding everything myself. Weekends and evenings after work, I'd drive the hour and a half from the city with my truck loaded with lumber and tools. I replaced every board on that dock, rebuilt the stone fireplace, spent 3 weeks rewiring the whole place because the previous owner had apparently learned electrical work from YouTube videos. My neighbors were mostly weekend people like me, and everyone kept to themselves. Perfect. I'd fish at dawn, work on the cabin during the day, and fall asleep to the sound of loons calling across the water. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't checking my phone every 5 minutes or lying awake, calculating what my ex-wife's lawyer was going to cost me next. The HOA didn't even register as a concern initially. Pine Ridge Estates had been incorporated in 1998, long after my cabin was built, and their covenants seemed to focus on the newer development on the south side of the lake. They maintained the boat launch, organized a 4th of July fireworks show, kept the common areas mowed, standard suburban HOA stuff that had nothing to do with my rustic corner of the lake. I paid my dues $180 a year, which seemed reasonable, and assumed we'd coexist just fine. That lasted exactly 14 months. The first sign of trouble came on a Saturday morning in July, when I was replacing some rotted deck boards. I heard a car door slam and looked up to see a woman in tennis whites marching down my driveway with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd found something deeply offensive. This was my introduction to Karen Hendricks. Though she introduced herself as Pine Ridge HOA, President Hendricks like it was a military rank. "You can't have that," she said, pointing at the small floating dock I'd anchored about 20 feet from shore. It was nothing fancy, just a simple platform where I could tie off my kayak and maybe dive in for a swim without walking through the marsh grass. "Can't have what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Personal watercraft infrastructure on community water resources. It's clearly stated in Section 4.7 of the covenants." She held up her clipboard like it was the Constitution. "You'll need to remove it immediately." I set down my drill and walked over to where she was standing. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion. This is my waterfront. The dock is on my property." Karen's laugh had the warmth of a January wind. "The lake belongs to the community, sir. All homeowners have equal access rights, which means no one gets to monopolize any portion of the water, surface with private structures." I spent the next 20 minutes trying to explain that my deed included lake frontage, that I owned to the high water mark, that the small dock was clearly within my property boundaries. Karen responded with increasingly condescending explanations of community standards and property values. Finally, she handed me a formal violation notice with a 30-day deadline to remove the dock or face a $500 fine. That night, I dug out my purchase paperwork and read through everything again. My deed clearly described the property as including all riparian rights and water frontage to the ordinary high water mark. The survey showed my boundaries extending into the lake. I had every legal right to that dock. and Karen Hendricks was either confused or deliberately overreaching. I decided to handle it the mature way. I emailed Karen the next day with copies of my deed and survey, politely explaining that my property rights included the water frontage where the dock was located. I suggested we could resolve this with a simple conversation. Her response arrived within an hour. Property boundaries are superseded by community covenants. Remove the dock or face escalating fines. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried everything reasonable. I forwarded her the relevant sections of state property law regarding riparian rights. I offered to meet with the HOA board to discuss the matter. I even suggested we could have the boundaries professionally surveyed if there was genuine confusion. Karen's responses grew increasingly hostile and legalistic. She informed me that my supposed property rights were irrelevant to community standards and that my aggressive legal posturing was being documented for potential harassment. Charges the dock stayed where it was, and 30 days later, I received my first $500 fine. Along with it came a new violation notice, apparently. I was now in violation for maintaining non-compliant exterior lighting because I'd installed a simple porch light that didn't match the HOA's rustic lodge aesthetic guidelines. This was followed by another notice about my non-conforming gravel driveway, which had been there since 1962. That was the moment something shifted in my thinking. I realized I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person who'd made an honest mistake about property boundaries. I was dealing with someone who'd decided I was a problem that needed to be controlled. And she was going to keep finding new ways to fine and harass me until I either submitted or left. Karen Hendricks had made this personal. She'd picked the wrong person to bully. I stopped responding to her emails and started reading. Not just HOA law, but water rights, property law, the history of Pine Ridge Estates itself. I spent evenings at the county recorder's office, pulling every document related to my property going back to the original land grants. I learned that my 2 acres had been carved out of a larger farm in 1960, and that the cabin's original owner had specifically negotiated for full riparian rights because he wanted to build a boat launch for his fishing guide. Business, more interesting, was what I discovered about Pine Ridge Estates itself. The HOA had been incorporated in 1998 to manage a new development of 37, but the covenants they'd filed with the county made sweeping claims about community control of all lake resources without any legal mechanism for actually acquiring those rights from existing property owners. They'd simply assumed they could regulate the entire lake because they represented the majority of homeowners. More I dug, the clearer it became that Karen's HOA was operating on bluff and intimidation. They had no legal authority over my waterfront, no mechanism for enforcing their rules on my property, and no standing to fine me for exercising riparian rights that had been recorded with the county for 63 years. But I also realized something else. If I was going to fight this, I needed to do it right. Karen had already demonstrated she'd escalate rather than back down, so I needed to be thorough. I spent 3 weeks documenting everything, every email, every violation notice, every fine. I photographed my dock from multiple angles, had my boundaries professionally surveyed, and got written opinions from 2 property law attorneys confirming that my riparian rights were unambiguous and legally protected. The final piece of the puzzle came. When I was reviewing the HOA's original incorporation documents, buried in the financial disclosures was something interesting. Karen Hendricks owned 3 properties in Pine Ridge Estates, not just one. She had her primary residence, a rental property, and a small lot she'd apparently been trying to develop, which meant she was paying HOA dues on 3 properties and as president. She'd been setting those dues annually without oversight from the membership. I started calculating. If Karen was abusing her position to harass property owners into compliance, what else might she be doing? I filed a public records request for all HOA financial documents, board meeting minutes, and correspondence with county officials. What I found was fascinating. Over the past 5 years, Pine Ridge Estates HOA dues had increased by 340%, far exceeding any reasonable maintenance costs. The HOA was carrying a cash balance of over $180,000, despite minimal actual expenses. Karen had been approving contracts with landscaping and maintenance companies that seemed to exist primarily on paper. Most damning of all, she'd been issuing fines and collecting them without any formal appeals process or legal authority. To do so, the picture that emerged was of a small-time tyrant who'd been running Pine Ridge estates like her personal kingdom, extracting money from homeowners through escalating dues and bogus fines, while enriching herself and her friends through questionable contracts. My dock violation wasn't about community standards, it was about establishing that. Karen could force anyone to comply with anything she decided to call a rule by this point. I'd received 4 more fines totaling another $1,500, along with increasingly threatening letters about legal action and liens on my property. Karen's latest communication informed me that I was being assessed a special community impact fee of $2,000 for ongoing violations affecting neighborhood property values. She was also demanding that I appear before the HOA board for a compliance hearing where I would be required to present a remediation plan for bringing my property into full compliance with community standards. That's when I decided it was time to end this. I showed up to Karen's compliance hearing with my leather folder and 3 witnesses: my property attorney, a retired county surveyor, and a CPA who specialized in HOA financial audits. The meeting was held in Karen's living room, with 4 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Karen started with a dramatic presentation about property values and community standards, displaying blown-up photos of my dock, like it was evidence in a murder trial. She announced that the board had voted to impose a lien on my property if I didn't immediately remove all violations and pay the accumulated fines, which now totaled $4,200. When she finished, I opened my folder and spread the contents across her coffee table. First came the 1960 deed with its explicit riparian rights language. Then the 1847 territorial water rights document that my property referenced. Then the county survey showing my boundaries extending well into the lake. Then the 2 legal opinions confirming that Karen's HOA had 0 authority over my waterfront or my dock. You have no legal standing to regulate my property, I said quietly. You never did. Every fine you've issued is legally meaningless. Karen started to object, but I kept going. More importantly, you've been operating this HOA like a personal business. Dues that have increased 340% with no justification. Contracts with companies that don't seem to exist. Fines collected without legal authority or due process. I turned to the other board members, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Did you know Karen owns 3 properties here? Did you know she's been paying herself consulting fees for HOA management services that aren't disclosed in your budgets? Did you vote to authorize the $180,000 in your treasury, or did you just assume Karen was handling things properly? The room went dead silent. Karen's face had gone from red to white to a shade of gray that suggested she was really understanding her situation for the first time. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. I'm filing complaints with the county attorney about your unauthorized fine collection and questionable financial management. I'm also filing a civil suit for harassment and demanding a full audit of HOA finances. But first, I'm invoking my rights as a property owner to demand an immediate special assessment to cover the legal costs of investigating how this HOA has been managed. I pulled out the final document, a property assessment notice I'd had prepared by my attorney. Karen, your 3 properties are being assessed $5,000 in legal fees effective immediately. The other board members can vote on whether they want to support a financial audit, or whether they'd prefer to accept resignations and dissolve this HOA entirely before the county gets involved. The meeting ended 20 minutes later with Karen's resignation and a unanimous vote to dissolve Pine Ridge Estates HOA. The other board members, once they understood what Karen had been doing, wanted nothing to do with potential legal liability. Within 6 months, the HOA was formally dissolved. Its remaining funds distributed back to homeowners, and Karen Hendricks had quietly sold all 3 of her properties and moved to a different state. I kept the dock, of course, But more than that, I kept the lake the way it was supposed to be: quiet, peaceful, and free from petty tyrants who think a clipboard and a title make them masters of other people's lives. These days, when I'm out on the water at dawn with my coffee and fishing rod, sometimes I see Karen's old house across the lake. The new owners are a young couple with 2 kids who wave when they see me on the dock. They fish from their own small pier now. Nobody bothers to check whether it meets any community standards. The water doesn't care about HOA covenants. It just reflects the sky and holds the fish and lets you swim in it when the summer gets hot, which it turns out is all I ever wanted in the first place.